In a small Jamaican community born from freedom, a shy boy who once struggled in school would grow to change the sound of a nation. His father sent him to learn mechanics, but the rhythm of destiny was louder. In the studios of Kingston, he listened, learned, and transformed the music, guiding it from its roots to the bold, new pulse of digital rhythm. Just beyond Kingston lies Fawahodi, a community built in freedom. When slavery was abolished in 1838, newly freed men and women settled there, naming it after a word from their Akan ancestors, meaning independence or freedom, a lasting tribute to their emancipation. They constructed homes, churches, and new lives, carrying the spirit of liberation in every story and song. Generations later, that same spirit of freedom, faith, and resilience still defines the community. Life in Fawahodi has never been easy, yet its people remain strong, grounded in the same hope that built their village. In this world of struggle and perseverance, a boy named Winston Grant was born, the youngest of 5 children of Mary and Sylvester Grant. Winston was quiet and withdrawn, a child who often struggled in school. No one could have imagined that this shy boy would one day help reshape the sound of Jamaican music. At 15, he struggled so badly with reading and writing that his parents pulled him out of school and sent him to learn mechanics at a garage in downtown Kingston. "Winston," Sylvester said, "I am taking you to Mr. Shaw tomorrow morning so you can learn a trade." "Boy, oh boy," Mary sighed. "I don't even know if you're going to learn anything." Sylvester shook his head. "I don't know why he finds learning so difficult," he said, "but we can't give up on him. All we can do is hope and pray that he finds his calling one day," Mary replied softly. "That's all we can do, Sylvester." The next morning, Sylvester took Winston to Mr. Shaw's garage to begin his apprenticeship. Kingston was rough, restless, and alive with creativity. The city moved to the rhythm of its own heartbeat, a pulse that fascinated Winston. Downtown was alive with sound. The streets throbbed with bass, and every corner seemed to hum with rhythm. Sound systems ruled the nights, and the city danced beneath the stars to the latest roots reggae hits. The voices of singers carried messages of struggle and hope through the warm evening air. The music spoke for the people, telling stories of faith, poverty, and resistance. Political tension filled the streets, yet the music never stopped. The singers and musicians of downtown were the soul of the streets. Winston watched them with wonder as they gathered outside record shops and studio gates. That was where he wanted to be, among the stars instead of under old, broken-down cars. After only a few days at the garage, he left and never went back. The music was pulling him like a magnet to steel. He began spending his days outside the studio gates, surrounded by singers and musicians who carried nothing but their voices, talent, and dreams. They came from the inner city and the countryside, each one chasing a chance to turn struggle into song. Music was their way out, their weapon, and their truth. Men stood outside with guitars in hand, waiting for an opportunity. Some rehearsed endlessly, harmonizing until their voices blended as one. When their moment came, they would step inside the studio and capture magic in a single take. Winston spent his time among them, filled not with ambition to sing, but with fascination. Out of that fascination grew a new curiosity, one that would soon call him toward an instrument he had never seen before. Winston lingered outside the studio gates for weeks, watching and listening. One afternoon, the lead bass guitarist of the studio band, Rocky Dredd, finally took notice of the quiet boy who always stood nearby. "Youth," Rocky called, his deep voice carrying across the yard. "You don't go to school?" Winston hesitated, startled to be addressed. He shook his head. "No, sir." "Why not?" Rocky asked, lighting a spliff and looking him over with curiosity. Winston lowered his gaze to the ground. "After I finished all-age school, I didn't pass the exam to go to high school," he said softly, his voice barely rising above the noise of the street. "My parents sent me to learn mechanics down by Mr. Shaw, but the music keeps calling me." Rocky tilted his head, studying the boy. "I see you don't like the trade," he said with a faint smile. "You love music, eh?" Winston nodded shyly. "Yes, sir, I do." Rocky chuckled. "So, can you sing?" Winston shook his head again. "No, sir. I have no musical talent, but somehow I just love music." Rocky's expression softened. He placed a hand on Winston's shoulder. "The music is calling you for a reason, youth," he said quietly. "Maybe one day you'll understand what it's trying to tell you." For the first time, Winston felt seen, as if someone finally heard the music that had been whispering inside him all along. From that day on, Rocky took a liking to Winston and began sending him to the shops. That simple errand gave Winston something priceless, a freedom pass through the studio gates. To set foot inside the yard was no small thing. Everyone who entered had to be approved by the gateman, and to step into the studio itself, one had to audition before the producer. But Winston, now Rocky's trusted assistant, stood right at the heart of it all. He soon became the gopher for the singers and musicians, running to the corner shop for cigarettes, alcoholic beverages, food, or whatever they wanted. Each errand brought spare change and a front row seat to genius. More than the money, though, Winston earned something greater, a place among the musical creators. Inside the studio, he watched as musicians built rhythms from scratch and engineers twisted knobs, shaping raw sound into magic. Simple melodies became deep, echoing songs that spoke of joy, struggle, and faith. The musicians were craftsmen, and the singers were poets. Most had little more than their instruments and their dreams, but they carried rhythm in their bones, and that rhythm took them across the world. Downtown Kingston was a living school of music, and the studio became Winston's classroom. Every session was a lesson, every song a chapter in his education. One evening, Winston went home to find his father pacing on the veranda. "Winston," Sylvester shouted, his voice echoing through the yard. "Mr. Shaw told me he hasn't seen you in months. Where have you been going?" Winston stopped at a safe distance, knowing his father's temper could turn physical. "Daddy," he said quietly, his tone respectful, "mechanic work is not for me. I love music." "Music," Sylvester scoffed. "Mary, come out here and listen to this nonsense." Mary stepped onto the veranda, her face tired and lined with worry. "Winston," she said calmly, "where have you been going?" "The boy says he doesn't like mechanics. He loves music," Sylvester muttered in disbelief. Mary blinked, searching Winston's face. "Winston," she asked, "are you smoking weed and trying to sing like those boys on the street corner?" "No, Mom," he replied quickly. "You better not be," Sylvester snapped. "Then what is it about music you love so much that keeps you away from learning a trade?" Mary asked. Winston hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Honestly, Mom," he said, "I haven't figured it out yet, but there's something about the sound that fascinates me. The band leader at Studio One took a liking to me and let me inside. I'm learning everything I can about how music is made, like an apprentice mechanic, but for music." Sylvester frowned. "That sponge brain of yours isn't soaking up anything. I don't want you hanging around those musicians. All they do is smoke, drink, take drugs, and have plenty of unwanted children with different women. Tomorrow you're going back to Mr. Shaw's garage." "Sylvester," Mary said softly, "if his heart isn't in mechanics, sending him back will only waste time. If his mind and heart are somewhere else, all we can do is support him and pray for the best. You never know, this might be his calling." From that evening onward, his parents accepted his decision, though Sylvester did so reluctantly. Every day, like clockwork, Winston was at the studio. He listened keenly. He didn't just hear the music, he felt it. He studied every beat, every chord, and imagined how the sound could be sharper, bolder, and new. His attention often turned to the keyboard. It wasn't his favorite instrument, but something inside him kept drawing his ear to it. He could hear possibilities in its tones that no one else seemed to notice. Soon, his fingers began to twitch whenever he watched the keyboardist play. In his mind, he was already pressing the keys, experimenting, creating. Mentally, he mastered the keyboard long before he ever touched one. One afternoon, a young singer auditioned his way past the gates and came into the studio to record his song. The musicians were struggling to find the right chords to match the melody. Frustrated, they decided to take a lunch break, leaving Rocky behind in the control room. Rocky sat in silence, tapping his fingers and trying to work out the bass line, but the notes refused to come together. Winston stood by the studio door, his heart pounding. He could hear the song replaying in his head. Every note, every chord, every harmony had already taken shape in his mind. He wrestled with himself, unsure if he dared to step forward. A will stronger than his doubts pushed him toward the keyboard. Rocky, his face buried in his palms, didn't even see him walk past. For a heartbeat, the studio held its breath. Then Rocky jumped, startled by a sound he had never heard before. The keyboard was alive, playing a melody that was both fresh and perfect. He lifted his head and froze. Winston stood over the instrument, fingers dancing across the keys. "What are you doing?" Rocky asked, his voice full of surprise. Winston stopped and looked up. "I heard you struggling to find the chords for the song," he said, breathless with nervous energy. "But I already heard it in my head." For a moment, Rocky said nothing. His face was a mix of disbelief and wonder. "You lied," he muttered at last. "You told me you had no musical talent." "Honestly, Mr. Rocky," Winston said quickly, "I didn't lie." "Then where did you learn to listen and play like that?" Rocky asked. Winston's voice softened. "Remember when you told me that one day I would figure out what the music was saying to me? That's what happened." Rocky stared at him, silent for a long moment, caught between awe and pride. "Play the keys again," he said finally. He called the singer back into the studio. "Sing the song again," he urged. The singer began, and Rocky joined in on the bass. Together, they built the rhythm, the melody weaving around Winston's phrase until the sound filled the room with life. When the last note faded, Rocky turned to him. "Winston, you're going to play the keys for this song." Winston's heart leapt with excitement, but when the musicians returned and heard Rocky's decision, they exploded in protest. Rocky stood his ground, but the musicians refused to play without their usual keyboardist. Voices rose, tempers flared, and the studio filled with tension. Frustrated, Rocky walked out, leaving the argument behind. An hour later, he returned to find most of the musicians gone. Only the drummer, the percussionist, and the guitarist remained. With Winston on the keyboard, Rocky began to lay down the track. The music flowed easily, each note finding its place. When the singer returned and laid his vocals, the song came alive. By the time they finished, it was late, and the streets were quiet. The buses and taxis had stopped running for the night. Rocky offered to take Winston home. During the ride, Winston told him about his life, his struggles, and how the pull of music had drawn him away from the garage. When they reached his house, Sylvester was standing outside, waiting. Rocky stepped out of the car as Winston introduced him to his father. Winston went inside, leaving the two men talking at the gate. Rocky told Sylvester about his son's good manners, his discipline, and his rare gift. Sylvester listened, silent but deeply moved. Later that night, as he lay beside Mary, he told her everything Rocky had said, pride and disbelief mixing in his voice. The next day, the song was released and became an instant hit. From that moment, Winston was no longer just a boy from Fawahodi. He was the new keyboardist at the studio, playing one-hit rhythm after another. The old keyboardist never played there again. Rocky took Winston under his wing, mentoring him into a top professional musician. Though he could not read musical notes, he played with an ear and instinct that few could match. His touch on the keys was precise and full of soul, and every melody he created carried his signature sound. Winston was tough, disciplined, and relentless. Within a few years, he became one of the most sought-after keyboardists in Kingston, recording sessions in every major studio and playing for the island's biggest singers. His sound was unmistakable, bold, and always a step ahead of its time. But Winston was not content with simply playing music. He wanted to transform it. He began experimenting with drum machines and synthesizers, tools that were still rare in a reggae world ruled by roots rhythms and live instruments. While others hesitated, Winston pressed forward, blending the pulse of electronics with the warmth of traditional Jamaican groove. From those long nights of experimentation came something entirely new, the digital dancehall sound. It burst out of Kingston and soon swept across the island, then the world. Before long, Winston stepped into production. His studio became a creative workshop where rhythms were born, tested, and released to rule the dance halls. From that small space came not just hit songs, but foundations for entire movements. His productions became blueprints for generations of artists and producers, shaping the sound of popular music around the world. Winston gained a reputation for his perfectionism and vision. In the studio, he demanded the best from every musician he worked with. People marveled at how he could take a simple rhythm and turn it into something extraordinary with just a few keystrokes. He was both a scientist and an artist, a man who could hear the future long before anyone else. Over the years, Winston developed not only a sharp ear for music, but also a sharp eye for beautiful women. His charm and growing fame drew attention wherever he went. Music was his first love, but fleeting romance quickly became his second. A known womanizer, Winston moved easily from one relationship to another, leaving a trail of hearts behind him. Women from all walks of life were drawn to him, singers, socialites, and dreamers who wanted to be close to his lights. Among them was Maria, a radiant woman from an upscale gated community. She carried herself with grace and confidence, so different from the world Winston came from. Yet, at the same time, he was involved with Tracy, a fiery and jealous young woman from the ghetto, whose love for him bordered on obsession. One humid Kingston night, Tracy's jealousy boiled over. She followed Winston and Maria, her car lights cutting through the darkness like a hunter closing in on prey. When they pulled into the hotel's car park, Tracy's heart pounded like a drumbeat of rage. The moment Winston and Maria stepped out of the car, Tracy burst from hers and stormed toward them. "Hey gal," she shouted, her voice sharp enough to cut the air. "What are you doing with my man?" Winston spun around, startled. "Tracy, what are you doing here?" Maria looked from Winston to Tracy, disbelief flooding her face. "Winston, you know her." "Yes, he knows me," Tracy snapped. "He belongs to me." Before anyone could react, Tracy's hand flew through the air and struck Maria hard across the face. The sound echoed through the car park like a crack of thunder. "Tracy, stop!" Winston shouted, stepping between them. Maria, trembling and furious, tried to push past him. "You're crazy!" she cried. Tracy lunged again, her eyes blazing. In the chaos, her knee came up, catching Winston squarely in the groin. He collapsed to the ground, gasping in pain as the two women clawed at each other. They crashed against the pavement, rage and jealousy tangled in every movement. Windows flickered open as the city watched the catfight unfold. "Stop! Stop it!" he yelled, struggling to pull them apart, his voice drowned by screams and curses. The noise filled the night. Guests peeked through windows, and a crowd began to gather. The hotel receptionist, horrified, grabbed the phone and called the police. By the time the police arrived, Winston and another man had managed to pull the women apart, though their voices still clashed in a storm of anger and insults. Two officers stepped out of the patrol car. As one of them approached, Maria turned toward him. Their eyes met, and the world seemed to stop. Her breath caught in her throat. Recognition struck her harder than any blow Tracy had thrown. "Maria," the officer said, his voice rising in disbelief. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be at home." Winston blinked, confused. "Officer, you two know each other." The officer's face hardened. "Know her? She's my wife." Tracy let out a wild, mocking laugh. "Officer, your wife is a cheater. She came here to sleep with my man." The officer's head snapped toward Maria. "Is that true?" he demanded. "Darling, I can explain," she stammered, trembling. "Explain," he shouted. "You told me you were going to bed early, so this is what you do while I'm on night shift." Maria stepped closer, tears welling in her eyes. "Please, listen." "Please, what?" the officer roared, cutting her off. Then his attention turned to Winston, his fury blazing. "So you're the man my wife's been sneaking around with," he growled, grabbing Winston by the collar. "Officer, let me go," Winston shouted, trying to pull free. The second officer moved in, seizing Winston by the back of his trousers. "You're under arrest," he barked. "For what?" Winston demanded. "I haven't done anything." The officers shoved him, rough and angry, their hands turned to fists, raining blows on his ribs and shoulders. Winston fought to defend himself, his patience snapping under the assault. He shoved one of them away, his voice echoing through the car park. In that instant, rage filled the air. The lead officer reached for his gun. "Stop!" someone screamed. For a heartbeat, the world slowed to a crawl, and then the sound shattered the silence. Two shots cracked through the night. Bang! Bang! Winston's body jolted, his hands flying to his stomach as he crumpled to the ground. The sound of screaming tore through the silence that followed. Tracy dropped to her knees beside him, screaming his name through tears that blurred her vision. She clutched his blood-soaked shirt as Winston's eyes fluttered weakly, then went still, leaving behind only silence where his heartbeat once was. Maria let out a piercing scream that tore through the night, echoing with horror and heartbreak. Her knees buckled, and she crumpled to the ground in a dead faint. Tracy cradled Winston's head in her trembling hands, her tears spilling onto his cheeks as she called his name again and again into the night. Around her, the car park had fallen into stunned silence. Bystanders stood frozen, their faces pale with shock. A woman gasped and covered her mouth. Another began to cry softly. Someone whispered, "Lord have mercy, officer, you didn't have to shoot him," while a man crossed himself, shaking his head in disbelief. Flashing lights washed over the scene in waves of blue as the police radio crackled in the distance. The air was thick with the sound of muffled sobs, distant sirens, and the hollow echo of a life that had just been cut short. The officers stood stiffly, their guns still drawn, with faces as stern as steel. The shooter froze, his eyes shifting from his unconscious wife to Tracy, who knelt beside Winston's lifeless body, her hands trembling and her clothes soaked in blood and grief. His hands quivered, his eyes vacant, as the weight of what he had done began to crush him. His partner looked around anxiously, sweat trickling down his face, his eyes darting between the crowd and the fallen man. Neither said a word. The tension hung heavy in the air, thicker than the smell of gunpowder. Under the harsh glow of the hotel lights, the man who had changed the sound of Jamaican music lay motionless on the concrete. Winston Grant was dead. News of Winston Grant's demise spread across Kingston before sunrise. By morning, it was on every radio, whispered in every bar, and shouted across every street corner. The city that had once danced to his rhythms now moved in slow motion, heavy with grief and disbelief. At the studio, musicians gathered in silence. The same room that had echoed with laughter and bass lines now held only the low hum of heartbreak. Someone placed a single candle on Winston's keyboard, its flame trembling like the beat of a broken heart. Winston was more than a musician, Rocky said quietly. He was the sound of innovation. Outside, fans gathered by the hundreds. Taxi drivers, market vendors, and school children all came to pay their respects. His songs played from every sound system, his melodies spilling through the streets like a prayer. In Fawahodi, Mary wept as Sylvester stood motionless beside her, staring into the distance. The boy they once feared would never find his way had become a legend, and now he was gone. The newspapers called it a tragedy in the dancehall. Talk shows debated who was to blame, the jealous lover, the enraged husband, or the system that gave too much power to a gun in the heat of emotion. But to the people, it was simpler. Jamaica had lost one of its brightest suns. At his funeral, the crowd stretched for blocks. Singers performed the songs he helped create, their voices trembling but proud. Rocky stood at the front, hands folded, head bowed. When the final song ended, the band played one of Winston's rhythms, slow and soulful. The bass rolled like thunder, and the crowd sang the words together, a chorus of love, pain, and memory. As the coffin was lowered, Mary whispered, "You found your calling, my son." The investigation led to charges against the officer who fired the shots, while his partner was accused of aiding in the unlawful killing. Yet no punishment could ever undo what was lost. Jamaica mourned one of its greatest musical innovators. His legacy lived on, carried in every rhythm, every beat, and every heart that his music once moved. His influence continued to flow through every genre of music across the world. And so, every time a rhythm shakes the soul, somewhere in the beat, Winston Grant lives again. Greatness often begins in the struggles of humble beginnings. Talent finds its voice when courage follows the heart's true calling. Those guided by faith, courage, and passion can turn hardship into a legacy that transforms the world. If you enjoyed the story, show some love, like, comment, and subscribe to Word, Sound, and Story, where Troy Mackenzie transforms real-life experiences into meaningful, dramatic, and entertaining tales. Thanks for watching. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Bless up.